folks, Dave Canterbury at the Pathfinder School, back out here with another video in our basic tarp setups for basic bushcraft. Before I show you this setup, I want to tell you that I do not recall ever seeing this particular setup of a tarp being used before. Does that mean that no one's ever done it? It absolutely doesn't, because chances are someone somewhere along the line has thought of this before I did. And that's the funny thing about bushcraft and survival. There's very few new ideas. It's just that things have either been improved on, jumbled around a little bit, or changed to fit a certain person's system. And a good example of that would be the 5 C's of survivability: a cutting tool, a combustion device, a cover element, a container, and cordage. Those 5 items have been in existence and carried all the way back to 3,500 years ago, Otzi the Iceman. He had those 5 items on his person along with his bow. So does that mean that Otzi invented it? Probably not, because someone else showed him or told him. And when I developed the 5 C's and 10 C's of survivability, I looked at several things. And one of the things I looked at was Otzi the Iceman. But looking at that, you can't take it at face value. You have to understand or analyze why those items, why those particular things. And if you look at them carefully, you understand that A, they take a specialized skill level to reproduce. B, they take specialized material to reproduce. C, they're probably going to be the things that most directly affect your survivability in some way, shape, or form, whether it's core temperature control or building something to help with core temperature control. So those 5 items are nothing new. The list of 10 items, like the 10 C's, nothing new. But it's not something that was developed in the 70s. It's not something developed in the 60s. It's not even something developed in the 50s. It goes beyond that. As far as I can see from research, there was a list of 10 essential items to carry that was put out by a club called the Mountaineers from the West Coast in the 1930s. And that list is printed on the internet, and it's been revamped a few times, and there's also another contemporary list of those items listed on REI's website. So 10 items is not a new concept. The 10 C's is a new concept, and the items within the 10 C's are a new concept. If you ask Nesmith, back in his day, what would be one of your preferred fire starting choices, he's going to tell you matches. But if you ask me that today, in 2013, 2014, would I want matches as one of my main fire starting implements? Absolutely not. I'd rather have the butane lighter, a ferrocerium rod, and a magnifying glass. Because in this day and age, we have that technology that makes a lighter a lot more viable to use than a stick match. So those things have to be thought about when you're doing your research and your dirt time. And those two things are brothers, and they have to be understood. You have to do the proper research. You've got to go back and read from sources from the old days. I don't read very many contemporary sources on bushcraft and survival, because most of them are just reprocessed information from old stuff that worked for that individual person. And what I want to see is what was back then, and how can I adapt it to work for me? Because what works for me may not work for the guy who wrote this book, may not be from the guy who wrote that book. Does that mean their books aren't worth buying or worth looking at? Absolutely not. But what I choose to do is first research the old stuff and then move into the contemporary. So the only book that I've really spent a lot of time reading or a lot of time analyzing the contents of is Bushcraft by Morse Kahansky. That's probably the most contemporary book I've sat down and analyzed what's inside that book to see if it's viable for the eastern woodlands that I live in compared to the boreal forest where Morse Kahansky lives. Beyond that, the books that I look at were written in the 1920s, the 1930s, the late 1800s, the mid 1800s, and I'll give you a list of authors that you can look at on this video real quick, that you can look their names up and find some of the sources, whether it be by hardback or paperback books off Amazon, Project Gutenberg, places like that are all places you can look to find these books. So if I dig out my glasses here real fast, I have a list written down in my pocket of a few of the authors that I have researched and read about and looked at their material to kind of develop some of the things that I use in my system today, or that I use to affect my survivability or to smooth it. Okay, I'm going to go through these real quick for you guys. Bernard Mason, George Washington Sears, Ernest Thompson Seton, Horace Kephart, Francis Cheeley, Daniel Baird, Philip Fagan, E. Krebs, Ellsworth Yeager, Hamilton Gibson, Warren Miller, And then you can go into people like Morse Kahansky, but that's getting in more contemporary. All of these authors that I just gave you the names of are authors that wrote books from the 1800s to the early 1900s, early turn of the century time period, pre-1950 basically. And those are a lot of the sources that I look at because I figure that those guys, that was the golden age of camping back in the 1930s and even in the late 1800s to the 1930s. That was kind of the golden age of people starting to get weekends and going out camping and spending time away from the civilized world. So those guys developed some very good ways of doing things, and that's the things that I look at when I go beyond frontier era mentality. And then I meld those things together to get where I'm at today. So let's talk about this shelter real quick because there's no name for this shelter. It's not like it's the Pathfinder shelter. It's just a configuration for an 8x8 tarp that I came up with that works really, really well. There's reasons it works well, and I'm going to explain them to you today. So stay with me, guys. Okay, so let's talk about this shelter real fast. Why I like it, why I think it's a good shelter, and how I set it up. This is an 8x8 tarp by tentsmiths.com. It's an oilskin tarp. It's about 200 bucks. But you can call Tent Smiths and you can order one of these tarps. Now, the area that's on the ground here in front is half of this tarp. The 4 feet of this tarp is out here on the ground. That's important to understand. We're going to use that in a minute. All right, so basically in the back of the tarp, you have the top of the tarp that is on a ridge line. So if we've got 4 feet of it on the ground, then we have basically 2 feet up and 2 feet across. And I have staked it down right at that midpoint of the tarp in the middle. And because this one has tie outs on the outside of the middle of the tarp, I was also able to stake it down in the center there. And it's staked down on the end there. And then it's just ran over a ridge line here between 2 trees. Now the front of this tarp is pitched in a downward angle. It's pitched at a downward angle for 2 reasons. Number 1, to shed rain. Number 2, so that it will hold heat. The back of that shelter, for the most part, is almost straight up and down. And now let's talk about what we're going to do with this 4 feet we got hanging out in the front. What we're going to do is we're going to use this 4 feet of shelter for not only our browse bed, but also our moisture barrier. Pop the stick under there. So we're going to figure that we've got 2 feet out to here. And what we're going to do with this is, in this case, I'm going to use a real heavy wool blanket shard. And I use this quite a bit. And if I fold this thing right, just about half like this, just a little bit less than half, it gives me something that's longer than my core that protects me from conduction. And I can put that all the way up against this, just like this. Pull it down just a shade. And I could do the same thing with leaves here. I could just stuff this with leaves all the way out to this midpoint. And I'm going to push this up against the side a little bit, just like this, to get it inside my 2 foot. Then I'm going to take this and fold it over the top. And I'm going to stake it down back here, and I'm going to stake it down here. All I'm going to do in the back there is use that same stake that I've already got in the corner. I'm going to pull that stake just like this, holding that corner. Put both of those through, stretch it out. And hammer that down. Now I'm going to do the same thing on the other end. And out here, I'm going to come here and pull this taut. So if I've got leaves in here, I pretty much have those leaves trapped. Okay, so what I've done is I've created a 2 foot wide browse bed and moisture barrier using my tarp in here. Like I said, I've got a blanket to battle conductivity here, but I could use browse in here just as easily if I wasn't carrying a wool blanket. And because this shelter has a downward slope, it's going to shed a lot of rain. This is doubled over. I'm not going to get rain in my shelter. The overhang is a little bit beyond the front of this browse bed because it's stretched tight and a little bit of an angle here. That's going to keep rain from coming in here on my bed. The less space I have to heat in between me and this back wall if I'm trying to do this in the wintertime, the better off I'm going to be. Guys, I appreciate you joining me out here today for this quick shelter setup video and this discussion on learning, research, dirt time, and things like that, because as I said, they do go hand in hand. And I would encourage you to look at some of these older authors from back in the day and look at what they have to say and kind of glean and develop your system, as I have, from ancient learnings or from learnings of the past. If you go back and look at part of the reason I developed the 10 C's the way I did and the 5 C's, if you go back and look at the Mountaineers list from the 1930s of their 10 essential items that they told people they should carry for emergencies, they had extra water on the list, but nothing about the container that water was in. Was it metal? Was it plastic? It wasn't specified. If I'm in a environment where there's going to be a lot of snow, and these guys were mountain climbers, I'm going to want something to be able to melt and process snow in the long run. Extra water is not enough. I'm not going to carry 4 or 5 gallons of water, but if I've got snow all around me to melt to make my water, or ice to make my water, then I have to have that metal container to put into the fire to be able to process that water. And little things like that that you can look at a list and glean from your own understandings of, I know I've got to have this, but it's not on this list, so how do I work that in? Those are the things that you need to do your research, do your dirt time to understand what you need and what works for you, and build several different types of shelters and find out what's going to work best for you in certain environments, certain times of the year. I would say this shelter concept I just showed you would be good for almost any time of the year in the eastern woodlands of Ohio. Doesn't make it a great shelter somewhere else. I'm Dave Canterbury at the Pathfinder School. I thank you for joining me for this video. I thank you for your comments. I thank you for your views. I thank you for everything you do for me, for my school, for my family, and everyone that's affiliated with the Pathfinder School and Self-Reliance Outfitters. I'll be back with another video as soon as I can. Thanks, guys.